Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer, and today is part 2 in our mini video series on Form 22B, the Home Sale Contingency Addendum. If you didn't watch last week, make sure you go back and watch it because we introduced the form and what the form actually does. In this video I want to talk about what it means for a buyer to waive their home sale contingency. In the last video we talked about the buyer who satisfies the home sale contingency. Today we're talking about waiver. Now let's go back a little bit and talk again about what's the purpose of the home sale contingency addendum. In the home sale contingency addendum, the buyer comes to seller and says, I really want to buy your property, but before I can buy your property I have to sell my property. And seller says, okay, but I'm going to keep my property on the market in a special category identified by each individual MLS, but on the market nevertheless, looking for other buyers. And if I get another buyer, then, seller says to the first buyer, then I can bump you. And the Form 22B includes a paragraph that we refer to as the bump provision. And the bump provision says that if seller accepts another offer, seller shall give buyer notice of the fact that seller has accepted another offer. Seller gives buyer that notice on Form 44, the statewide Form 44. Buyer has however many days are in the bump period. And again, there's a blank space in the paragraph on Form 22B, the bump provision paragraph, where buyer and seller identify the number of days that buyer will have to respond to seller's delivery of notice that seller has accepted another offer. By default, that number of days is 5. Buyer and seller can agree to any number of days they want in that time period. Let's just say it's 5. Buyer has a 5-day bump provision. So if buyer receives seller's bump notice, buyer has 5, and based on the computation of time provision, that would be 5 business days to respond to seller's bump notice. In those 5 days, there's a very short list of things that can happen. Buyer can get really lucky and sell their property within those 5 days. And if they do, then buyer will have satisfied the home sale contingency, and they'll give notice to seller of that on a Form 90K, and it takes us back to the video that the first video in this series. Or buyer can fail to sell their property within those 5 days and give notice to seller that buyer was unable to sell their property and that seller is free to terminate the purchase and sale agreement between seller and the home sale contingency buyer and move forward with the other offer that seller has accepted. Or the third thing that buyer can do is if they haven't sold and they want to proceed with the purchase of seller's property anyway, then buyer can waive the home sale contingency. Waiving the home sale contingency is a big deal for a buyer. When a buyer waives the home sale contingency, buyer automatically and necessarily, based on the boilerplate language of Form 22B, buyer automatically waives every other contingency benefiting buyer. Buyer waives any financing contingency buyer may have had, waives any inspection contingency buyer may have had, any title review contingency, HOA documentation contingency, etc., etc. Any contingency that buyer may have had benefiting buyer, when buyer waives the home sale contingency, buyer waives every other contingency as well, and buyer agrees to close the transaction 30 days later. So buyer waives their home sale contingency, they waive every other contingency benefiting buyer, and they agree to close the transaction 30 days later. So if they are unable to get their funding for their loan by day 30, seller has no obligation to extend the transaction, buyer has no contingencies, We have a sale fail, and seller is entitled to the remedies identified on the face of Form 21. That is what waiver means under the home sale contingency addendum. Buyer brokers, you must make sure your buyer understands this consequence before buyer agrees to waive the home sale contingency. Before we leave this topic, I want to spend a few minutes talking about what listing brokers need to be aware of operating under the bump provision of Form 22B. Listing brokers, you've got a home sale contingent buyer out there, and your seller gets another offer. One of the questions that I often get is, what if that bumping offer is also a home sale contingent offer? Can seller accept that? And the answer is, of course. What if the bumping offer is for a total of $10 purchase price? Could seller accept that? Of course. The answer is, seller can accept any offer that seller wants to accept as a bumping offer. There's no limit and no restriction on the offer terms that seller can accept as a bumping offer. The regulatory factor here is that seller is accepting this other offer. So if the first buyer goes away, seller is bound to the terms of agreement with this other buyer. So seller's not going to accept another offer if that offer is for a $10 purchase price, for example. The other thing, listing brokers, that you have to know is that when your seller accepts a bumping offer, you have got to attach a Form 39, second buyer's addendum, to that transaction. And let me say it differently. Seller can't simply accept a bumping buyer's offer. Seller has to counter a bumping buyer's offer by attaching a Form 39. The Form 39 second buyer's addendum is the portion of the contract between seller and the bumping buyer that creates the contractual opportunity for seller to avoid the obligations of this contract with the second buyer if the first buyer doesn't go away. If the first buyer waives their home sale contingency and says, no, I want to move forward in this transaction, then seller's got to have a way of getting rid of the second buyer. Form 39 gives the seller the ability to terminate the transaction with the second buyer if the first buyer doesn't go away. Form 39, though, is also a resource for sellers. If you look at Form 39, under paragraph 2 of Form 39, there's a series of checkbox marks on provisions. I'm sorry, that was really silly the way I said that. If you look at Form 39, paragraph 2, there's a series of checkboxes underneath that provision, and each of those checkboxes correlates to some benefit that will be bestowed to seller. The benefit may be that buyer is required to waive their financing contingency. Buyer is required to waive their inspection contingency. Buyer is required to waive their right to terminate the agreement based on the Seller's Disclosure Act, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole series of checkboxes there with benefits to seller attached with each one, associated with each one. Seller, when you counter buyer's offer to include Form 39, you can check some of those boxes. And the significance of checking those boxes is that seller will not be required to bump the first buyer's offer until the second buyer has conformed with those requirements. So if, for example, the second buyer has to waive their inspection contingency before seller has to deliver the bump notice to the first buyer, then if that happens, then by the time seller bumps the first buyer, seller knows that they're now working with a buyer who is truly committed to the property. They've already been through their inspection process, and that inspection contingency issue is resolved. So listing brokers, make sure that you include that Form 39. If you fail to include Form 39 when seller accepts the bumping offer, the result of that is that seller will have sold their property twice to two different buyers. They've got the first home sale contingency buyer, and they've sold to the second buyer without any provision that allows them to terminate either agreement. All right, in the next video, we're going to talk about some issues that come up all the time with respect to actual use of Form 22B. In the meantime, if you have any questions on Form 22B or any other form, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.